The cold wind whipped through the cemetery, carrying with it a chill that seemed to cut through Richard Collins' very soul. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the bouquet of lilies, his mind elsewhere. He had come to visit Grace, the love of his life, as he did every week since her untimely passing, a promise he made to her. But today, something was different. Something he couldn't place, but something that gripped him in a way he couldn't ignore. As he approached the grave, he noticed two small figures huddled near the headstone. Two girls, barely 6 years old. Their ragged clothes barely kept the chill at bay. Richard's breath caught in his throat. They didn't belong here. His heart raced. And before he could make sense of it, the older of the two girls looked up. Her dark eyes met his, and something about her gaze, familiar yet haunting, made his chest tighten. For a moment, Richard couldn't understand why. "Are you okay?" he asked, kneeling before them. His voice wavering as confusion settled in his bones. The older twin stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "We came to see Mrs. Collins," she said softly, her voice betraying a fragility that matched her small, trembling form. "She promised to take care of us." Richard's heart skipped a beat. Mrs. Collins? Grace? The words hung in the air, and for a split second, the world around him seemed to stop moving. His wife had promised to take care of them? This was no coincidence. He couldn't fathom it, but something told him there was more to this story, more that he needed to understand. "Who are you?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper, his pulse quickening. "I'm Anna," the older twin replied, her voice thick with uncertainty. "This is Mia." Richard's mind raced. How could these girls be here in the cold, standing before Grace's grave? What had they known of his wife? "Why are you here alone?" Richard's voice cracked, the weight of the moment sinking in. His body felt heavy, as if he were being pulled under water. "We were looking for her," Anna replied, her small voice almost inaudible. "Mom said, she said Mrs. Collins would help us if something ever happened." The words hit Richard like a freight train. Grace had promised them? He had never known about this, never heard a word about these girls, about Grace's secret promise. His mind spun with unanswered questions. "Where's your mother?" Richard's voice barely held steady. "She's sick," Mia whispered, clutching her sister's sleeve as if the world might crumble if she let go. "She told us to find Mrs. Collins." Richard stood up slowly, his knees weak as nausea rose in his throat. He had been prepared for grief, for quiet reflection, but not for this. This mystery that reached into the heart of his wife's past. "Come with me," Richard said, his voice firm despite the storm of emotions inside him. "We need to talk." Richard led the girls to a small diner on the outskirts of town. The neon lights flickered above them, casting long shadows across the quiet street. The waitress greeted them with a smile, but Richard barely noticed as he guided the twins to a booth in the corner. The air in the diner felt warm against the chill they had left behind in the cemetery, but it did little to ease the heaviness in Richard's chest. The girls slid into the booth, their small hands gripping the edge of the table. Anna, the older twin, looked down at her hands, fidgeting nervously. Mia, on the other hand, was staring intently at Richard, her wide, innocent eyes searching him for answers. Richard sat across from them, his thoughts in turmoil. How could he have missed this? How could Grace, the woman he had shared his life with, kept this secret from him? He stared at the menu. Though he wasn't hungry, his mind kept racing back to the grave, to the words the twins had spoken. Mrs. Collins had promised them help. Grace had promised him something, and now Richard was caught in the middle of a mystery he had no idea existed. Finally, Anna spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We came here because she promised," she repeated, her voice laced with the quiet desperation of a child seeking safety. "She promised to help us if something bad happened to Mommy." Richard's fingers tightened around the glass of water in front of him. His heart thudded in his chest as he looked at Anna, her eyes filled with unspoken fear. "How do you know Grace?" Richard asked, his voice low, barely able to contain his curiosity and growing unease. The twins exchanged a glance, one that spoke volumes without a word being said. Then Anna, after a long pause, spoke again. "She helped my mommy," she said, her voice steady but filled with the weight of memory. "A long time ago, when we didn't have food, she gave us something to help." Richard blinked, his mind reeling. "What did she give you?" he asked, leaning forward, unable to shake the feeling that this moment was more important than he could possibly understand. "I don't know exactly," Anna said, her gaze turning inward as if the memory itself was too painful to hold. "But Mommy always said Mrs. Collins saved her." "Saved us." Richard sat back, his mind spinning. Saved? This was more than just charity. This was a promise. But why hadn't Grace ever mentioned it? How had he never known that his wife had been helping people in this way? He couldn't understand it. He couldn't let it go. Before he could ask another question, Anna's voice broke through his thoughts again. "Where are we going to stay now?" Richard looked at them. Two little girls, so fragile and lost, sitting across from him, waiting for answers. He couldn't just leave them here. Not like this. His mind was racing, but there was one thing he knew for sure. He couldn't let them go, not without helping. He placed his hand over his chest, feeling the weight of the promise he was about to make. He looked up at Anna and Mia, meeting their eyes. "We'll figure this out. Stay close." The sterile, antiseptic smell of the hospital hit Richard as soon as he walked through the doors. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, adding to the cold, clinical feel of the place. Richard felt his stomach churn, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had to figure out what was happening, why the twins had come to him, and what Grace had been keeping from him. But standing at the threshold of room 214, Richard wasn't sure if he was ready for the answers. Anna and Mia clung to each other, their small hands clasped tightly as they walked behind Richard. The soft shuffle of their footsteps echoed in the otherwise silent hallway. Richard's own footsteps were heavier, his mind spinning with questions he couldn't answer. Room 214 was at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. Richard pushed it open, and the sight before him made his heart drop. Angela Bennett, the girl's mother, was lying in the bed, hooked to machines, her frail form pale and thin. Her eyes fluttered open as Richard entered, and for a moment she looked confused, almost lost. "Mom," Anna whispered, rushing to her mother's side. "We found her. Mrs. Collins." Angela's face softened, a faint smile curling her lips despite the exhaustion. She reached out with a trembling hand, brushing Anna's hair out of her face. "My girls," she murmured. "You found her." Richard stood at the foot of the bed, unsure of what to do or say. He had so many questions, but right now, all he could do was watch as a mother and her children were reunited. He had no idea how Grace fit into this picture, but the connection between the girls and his wife was undeniable. "You mean Grace?" Richard finally asked, his voice low. Angela nodded weakly. "She kept her promise," Angela said, her voice barely audible, her breath shallow. "She always did. She promised to help us if anything happened." Richard's chest tightened. "How did she know you?" Angela closed her eyes, her breathing shallow. "She saved me. A long time ago, when I had nothing, when I didn't know where to turn. Grace gave me a second chance." She looked up at Richard, her eyes filled with gratitude and sadness. "She promised me that if something ever happened, she'd take care of my girls." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. His mind couldn't wrap around the fact that Grace had kept this hidden from him. She had been helping others, saving others, while he had been grieving, unaware of the full extent of her kindness. "Why didn't she tell me?" Richard asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't she tell me about this?" Angela's face softened, her lips barely parting as she whispered, "She didn't want to hurt you. She knew you were grieving. She didn't want to burden you with her secrets. But she made sure you would find them. She knew you would." Richard's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He couldn't process it all at once. There was so much more to Grace than he had ever known, and now he was left to carry the weight of her promises. His heart raced with confusion and responsibility. Angela's faint voice interrupted his thoughts. "The girls, they need you now. Promise me you'll take care of them." Richard's voice caught in his throat as he nodded. "Of course, I will." The night stretched on in silence as Richard drove the girls back to his mansion. The soft hum of the car's engine seemed to echo the tension in his chest. His thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions, ranging from anger to guilt, confusion to tenderness. The weight of everything. The girls, Grace's secret life, the promise he now had fulfilled, pressed down on him. But somehow, in the midst of it all, something unexpected stirred within him. A sense of protectiveness, of duty, of something deeper than he had ever felt before. As they pulled into the long driveway of his estate, the house loomed ahead, a stark contrast to the small, fragile lives he now found himself responsible for. Richard knew he had to step up. He couldn't back down from this. He had to honor Grace's legacy, but the truth was, he didn't know where to begin. How did one care for two little girls who had already lost so much? How could he even begin to understand the depths of what they had gone through? The front door opened before they even reached it, and Richard was greeted by the sight of his housekeeper, Marie, standing with a concerned look on her face. She glanced at the girls, then back at Richard, her gaze softening. "You found them?" she asked gently. Richard nodded, his voice rough. "Yes. They were at Grace's grave. Their mother's in the hospital. They need a place to stay." Marie didn't ask any further questions. She stepped aside, allowing Richard and the girls to enter. The warmth of the house was a welcome relief from the cold that had followed them from the cemetery, but it did little to ease the heaviness Richard felt in his chest. "Are you hungry?" Marie asked the girls, her tone soft and kind. Anna nodded, her eyes wide as she looked around the grand entryway. Mia clung to her sister's side, her small hand gripping the older girl's sleeve. It was clear they weren't used to this kind of environment. The mansion, with its high ceilings and polished floors, must have seemed like a world they couldn't quite understand. Richard knelt beside them, his voice steady but filled with warmth. "We're going to stay here for a while. You'll be safe here, I promise. And we'll figure everything out together, okay?" Anna looked up at him, her expression still wary but full of trust. "You're like Mrs. Collins," she said softly. Richard's heart clenched at the mention of Grace. She had always been the one to offer comfort, to provide warmth when the world seemed cold. Now, Richard had to do the same. He had to carry on the legacy of love and care that Grace had so freely given. "Let's get something to eat," Richard said, standing up and offering his hand. "Then we can figure out the next steps." Marie led them to the kitchen, where the girls eagerly sat at the table, their eyes bright with hunger but also curiosity. Richard watched them for a moment, a sense of protectiveness rising within him. These girls had been through more than anyone their age should have to endure. And now, it was his responsibility to help them heal, to give them the love and security they needed. As Marie prepared a quick meal for them, Richard sat at the table, watching the girls. There was so much he needed to know about Grace's connection to them, about the secret life she had kept hidden. But for now, he pushed those questions aside. The girls were here, safe, and that was all that mattered. The next few days passed in a blur. Richard did his best to keep things as normal as possible for the twins, though the underlying tension was ever present. Every time he looked at them, he was reminded of the promise he had made to Grace, the promise that had led him down this unexpected path. But as the days wore on, it became clear that the weight of this responsibility was more than he had anticipated. He spent most of his time in the office, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions and thoughts that had overtaken his life. But no matter how many reports he reviewed or calls he took, his mind kept drifting back to Anna and Mia. The uncertainty in their eyes haunted him, the fragility of their trust pushing him to his limits. They needed him, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the pressure weighed heavily on him. One afternoon, after a long, exhausting day at work, Richard returned to the mansion to find Anna sitting on the steps outside, her knees drawn to her chest. Mia was nowhere to be seen. Richard's heart skipped a beat as he approached her, his steps slow and deliberate. "Anna?" he called gently, his voice soft to avoid startling her. She didn't look up at first, her gaze fixed on the sprawling lawn in front of her. Richard could see the loneliness in her posture, the way her small shoulders hunched forward as if she were carrying the weight of the world. "Anna, where's Mia?" Richard asked, concern creeping into his voice. "She's playing inside," Anna replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard sat down beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the estate. But the beauty of it didn't seem to reach Anna. He could feel the tension in the air, the emotional distance that had started to grow between them. "How are you feeling?" Richard asked, his voice soft but insistent. He needed to know if she was adjusting, if she was still carrying the burden of everything that had happened. Anna looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to read him. Then she spoke, her voice filled with quiet sorrow. "It's strange here," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Everything is so big, so empty." Richard's chest tightened. He could only imagine how overwhelming the mansion must feel to the twins, how out of place they must have seemed in a house that had always been filled with nothing but the echoes of his own grief. "I know it's not easy," Richard said, his voice low, "but I promise you're safe here. We'll figure this out together." Anna didn't answer at first. She just stared out at the horizon, her expression distant. Then finally, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think we'll ever feel like we belong here?" The question hit Richard like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just a question about the mansion. It was about life, about trust, about love. Could they ever feel at home again after everything they'd been through? Could he ever make them feel the security and warmth that they needed? He wasn't sure he had the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to try. "I don't know," Richard admitted, his voice tinged with sadness. "But I'm going to make sure you have a home here. I'll do whatever it takes to make this work." Anna looked up at him then, her eyes wide, filled with something akin to hope. For the first time since he'd met them, Richard saw a flicker of something other than fear in her gaze. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance of them to heal. The silence stretched between them. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a kind of silence that came after a heavy conversation, the kind that allowed both of them to process the weight of what was being said without needing more words. Finally, Anna spoke again, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. "Thank you." Richard smiled, though it felt strained. "You don't need to thank me. You're family now." Days turned into weeks, and the weight of the promise Richard had made to Grace grew heavier with each passing moment. The mansion, once a symbol of Richard's success and solitude, now felt like a prison, a gilded cage where the echoes of his past collided with the responsibilities of his present. Anna and Mia were adjusting, but the uncertainty of their future lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Richard found himself spending more time at the mansion, less focused on work and more on the girls. He had hired tutors to ensure they didn't fall behind in school, and even brought in therapists to help them process their trauma. But nothing seemed to fill the void of the life they had lost. The house was still too quiet, too empty, too full of memories of Grace. One evening, after another long day of work and trying to keep everything together, Richard was sitting at his desk, reviewing documents that seemed insignificant in the grand scheme of things. He could barely focus. His mind kept drifting to the twins, to their vulnerability, and the way Grace's absence had created a hole in all their lives. Suddenly, the sound of a knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. Before he could answer, Anna appeared in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted by the dim light in the hallway. "Can I talk to you?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with an intensity that caught Richard off guard. "Of course, come in," he said, standing up and gesturing for her to sit. Anna hesitated for a moment before walking in. She looked down at her feet, her hands wringing nervously in front of her. Richard could tell that whatever she wanted to say, it was weighing heavily on her. "I've been thinking," Anna started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you've been trying really hard to make things work, and I'm grateful. But—" She trailed off, her words faltering. Richard's heart clenched at the uncertainty in her voice. "But—" he prompted gently, stepping closer to her. Anna finally looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "But I don't think I can stay here. Not forever." The words hit Richard like a slap. He wasn't prepared for this, not after everything they had been through. The thought that Anna might leave, might feel like an outsider in his home, cut through him like a blade. "What do you mean?" Richard asked, his voice quiet, as he tried to hold back the surge of emotion building in his chest. Anna took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to make things harder for you. You've already done so much. But I think Mia and I need to go back to where we came from, to figure things out on our own." Richard felt a surge of panic rise in his chest. The idea of losing them, of failing Grace in the only way he knew how to protect them, sent a wave of terror through him. He hadn't expected to hear this from Anna, especially after everything they had been through together. "No," Richard said, his voice firm. "You're not a burden, Anna. You and Mia are my responsibility now. You belong here with me. I promised Grace I'd take care of you, and I'm going to keep that promise." Anna shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "But I don't know if I can feel a home here. It's too much, too different. I don't belong in a place like this." Richard stepped forward, his heart aching for her. "Anna, you do belong here. I'm not letting you leave. You're family now, and I won't let you feel like you don't belong. I'll make sure of that." Anna looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. For the first time since they had arrived, she seemed to believe him. The trust between them, fragile as it was, seemed to solidify in that moment. "I don't want to lose you," Richard said, his voice rough with emotion. "I won't let you go." Anna wiped away the tears from her eyes and nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll stay. For now." Richard smiled, a small but genuine smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good. We'll figure out together, I promise." The following days were filled with a quiet, tentative routine. Richard threw himself into his work with renewed determination, yet his thoughts were never far from the twins. They had slowly started to adjust to their new surroundings, but there was still an underlying tension, a heaviness that hung between them all. Richard could feel it when he looked at Anna, when he caught her stare at the walls, as if they were too large to ever feel like home. He knew it would take time, but the pressure weighed heavily on him. He needed to do more, something more than just offer a roof and food. One evening, after a long day of meetings and calls, Richard returned home earlier than usual. As he entered the house, he found the twins in the living room, sitting on the floor surrounded by books and toys. The sight of them trying to adjust to this new life, so unlike anything they had known, made his heart ache. He couldn't let them down, not when they needed him most. "Anna, Mia," Richard said softly, walking toward them. Anna looked up first, her eyes wary but hopeful. Mia, on the other hand, was still wrapped in the quiet sadness that had become her constant companion. Her small hands gripped a stuffed bear tightly, as if it were the only thing that kept her tethered to the world. Richard knelt down in front of them, a smile tugging at his lips despite the weight on his shoulders. "How are you both feeling?" Anna hesitated, glancing at Mia before speaking. "It's different," she said slowly, trying to choose her words carefully. "I don't know how to fit in here. It's like a whole new world. It's hard to understand." Richard nodded, his expression softening. "I understand," he said quietly. "It's hard for me, too, but we'll get through this. I'll make sure you both have everything you need. You're not alone." Mia looked up at him then, her big eyes full of silent questions. "Will we ever feel normal again?" she asked, her voice small, unsure. Richard's heart twisted. He had no answer for her. He didn't know if there was a way to make their lives normal again. All he knew was that he would do everything in his power to help them find peace. "I'll help you find your way," Richard said gently, reaching out to ruffle Mia's hair. "And I'm not going anywhere. You can stay here as long as you need. This is your home now." Anna's eyes softened at his words, but her face still held that shadow of doubt. She wasn't convinced. She didn't yet trust that this could be permanent, that Richard, too, could be counted on. "We'll figure out together," Richard added, his voice steady, but his heart heavy with the realization that healing wouldn't come quickly. There was no immediate fix. This was going to be a long journey. Over the next few days, Richard worked to bridge the emotional gap between himself and the twins. He took them on small outings, trying to show them parts of the world outside the mansion. He brought them to the park, watched them play with other children, and even took them out for ice cream, hoping to create a moment of happiness amidst the uncertainty. But still, every evening, the questions loomed in the back of his mind. Questions about Grace, about the hidden side of her life that he had never known. It wasn't until one rainy afternoon that Richard finally felt the first stirrings of true connection with Anna. He had just finished a business call when he noticed her sitting quietly by the window, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot cocoa. The storm outside reflected the turmoil that had been building in the house, a quiet storm of emotion and uncertainty. Richard approached her slowly, his heart heavy with unspoken words. He knew this moment was crucial. If he wanted to help Anna open up, he had to give her space to speak. "Anna," he began softly, his voice calm, "I know this isn't easy. I know you're struggling, but you're not alone in this. I want to understand what you're feeling." Anna looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with intensity that seemed to peer right through him. For a moment, she said nothing, just held his gaze, as if weighing his sincerity. "I don't know how to be here," she whispered. "I don't know how to feel safe. It's too much. I don't know where we belong anymore." Richard swallowed hard, his chest tightening with emotion. He couldn't imagine what they had gone through, the pain, the fear, the loss. But he knew one thing. He couldn't let them carry it alone, not when they had already lost so much. "I know it's hard," he said quietly, kneeling beside her, "but I promise you I'm here. I'll help you find your way. And I'll make sure you and Mia have a place in this world, wherever you need to be." Anna didn't respond immediately, but after a long pause, she nodded slightly, as if accepting his words. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Richard could see the faintest glimmer of trust in her eyes. It was a small thing, but it meant the world to him. The next morning, Richard couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. He sat at his desk, sorting through paperwork, but his mind was miles away. The phone buzzed. pulling him out of his thoughts. But the caller's name made his stomach twist. It was a number he didn't recognize. With a deep breath, he answered the call. "Mr. Collins," the voice on the other end said, smooth but clipped. "We need to talk." Richard's heart skipped a beat. He didn't recognize the voice, but it sounded strangely familiar, like someone he should know. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice steady despite the rising tension in his chest. "Someone who knows more about your wife's past than you think," the voice replied, its tone cold. "I think it's time you learn the truth." Richard's blood ran cold. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Grace's past. What could this person possibly know that he didn't already? The thought of someone from Grace's past reaching out like this sent a shiver down his spine. "Where are you?" Richard asked, his voice firm but laced with concern. "I'll be in touch," the voice said, and then, without another word, the line went dead. Richard stared at the phone, his grip tightening around it as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. The words echoed in his mind. "I think it's time you learn the truth." What truth? What had Grace been hiding from him? Later that evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Richard found himself walking through the quiet hallways of the mansion, his mind a storm of questions. He couldn't let this go. He had to know the truth about Grace, about everything she had kept hidden from him. He needed answers, and the person who had called him tonight was the key. He paused in front of the study, the door slightly ajar. Inside, the faint glow of the desk lamp illuminated the room. Richard stepped inside, his eyes scanning the shelves. Books on business, history, and law lined the walls, but it was a file cabinet in the corner that caught his attention. He walked over and pulled open the top drawer, his fingers brushing over the manila folders inside. His breath caught his throat as he pulled out one labeled simply, Grace. His heart hammered his chest as he opened the file, revealing a stack of documents, letters, and receipts. It didn't take long for him to realize that this wasn't just paperwork. This was a record of Grace's charity work, much more extensive than he could have imagined. Donations, medical bills paid under false names, and in the back, a list of families that Grace had secretly helped over the years, including the Bennett family. The name of the hospital where Angela Bennett had been treated, Mercy Hospital, was at the top of one of the receipts. Richard's mind raced as he pieced everything together. Grace had been helping more people than just the twins. She had been running a charity, a secret charity. And now, the girls, the Bennett family, were connected to that legacy. But what did it all mean? What was Grace's involvement in all of this? And why had she kept it from him? That night, after hours of reading through the documents, Richard sat in the study, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He didn't know what to think. Grace had been living a double life, one he had never known about. She had been helping families like the Bennetts, saving them in ways he never could have imagined. But what had that meant for their marriage? Why hadn't she told him? Suddenly, he heard the soft padding of footsteps behind him. He turned around to find Anna standing in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted by the dim light in the hallway. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. Richard closed the file quickly, his heart skipping a beat as he met her gaze. "I'm fine," he said, his voice more strained than he intended. "Just thinking." Anna stepped into the room, her eyes searching his face. "You're always thinking. You don't tell me what's wrong." Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything he was carrying. He knew he couldn't keep this secret from her, not after everything they had been through together. "I'm trying to understand everything," he said slowly, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Your mother, Grace, I never knew she was helping so many people. It's all overwhelming." Anna looked at him, her face serious. "Grace wasn't just our mom's friend, was she?" she asked, her voice steady. "She was more. I think she knew about us before we even came here." Richard's heart tightened. She was right. Grace had known more than he had ever realized. And now, her legacy was a burden he was left to carry. But he wouldn't turn his back on the twins. Not now. Not when they needed him the most. "No," Richard said softly, standing up and walking over to her. She wasn't just a friend. She was a guardian angel. And now, I have to make sure her promises are kept. Anna nodded, her expression softening. "We'll be okay, right?" Richard smiled, though it was a weary smile. "We will be." The next morning, Richard awoke with a lingering sense of unease. The night had been filled with restless thoughts, each one more unsettling than the last. Despite the early hour, he had already found himself sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the papers Grace had left behind. The quiet hum of the house felt different now, more suffocating, less comforting. The mansion, once a symbol of solitude and wealth, now seemed like a place of confusion and hidden truths. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, Richard thought about the twins. He hadn't seen them yet this morning, and a small part of him wondered if they were feeling the same weight of their new reality. They had come to him out of nowhere, bringing with them secrets about Grace he never knew existed. The sense of responsibility he had felt when they first arrived was now clouded with suspicion and confusion. He couldn't ignore the phone call from the night before, the mysterious voice on the other end, the promise of answers. Was this person trying to help him, or was there something more to this? The unknown hung heavily in the air, and Richard knew he couldn't wait any longer to get to the bottom of it. He had to find the truth, for the sake of the twins, and for his own peace of mind. As he sat back down at his desk, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Richard glanced up, surprised to see Anna standing in the doorway, her face unusually serious. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Richard nodded, gesturing for her to come in. He had a feeling that whatever she wanted to discuss was important. She had been distant lately, and he knew the emotional toll of everything was beginning to weigh on her. "Of course," Richard said, his voice warm but laced with concern. "What's on your mind?" Anna hesitated before stepping into the room, her eyes avoiding his as she took a seat across from him. There was something different about her today, something that felt almost grown up, as if the burden of the past weeks had forced her to mature far beyond her years. "I've been thinking," Anna began, her voice steady but filled with an emotional undertone that Richard couldn't quite place, "about Grace and about what she promised us." Richard's chest tightened at the mention of Grace. He had thought about nothing but her lately, her secrets, her promises, her life that he never truly knew. He had tried to shield Anna and Mia from the darker parts of their new reality, but he could sense that Anna wasn't going to let this go. "Grace kept a lot of secrets," Richard said softly. "But everything she did, everything she promised, it's all coming to light now. And I won't let you or Mia be caught in the middle of this." Anna's eyes flicked to his, and for the first time, Richard saw something in her expression, a mix of fear and determination. "I don't know if I can believe everything she did," Anna said quietly. "I'm starting to wonder if we're supposed to be here, if we really belong in a place like this." Richard's heart ached. He had never wanted this for Anna, not this confusion, not this uncertainty. He had promised Grace that he would protect them, that they would have a place here, but Anna was struggling to see it the same way. "I don't know if we'll ever belong here," Anna continued, her voice shaking with emotion. "But I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back to what we had." Richard sat back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. He had promised Grace that he would be there for them, but Anna's doubt was an obstacle he hadn't expected. How could he make her see that this was where they belonged? How could he give them the security they needed when he wasn't sure he even understood it himself? He stood up slowly and walked toward her, his gaze soft but filled with resolve. "Anna, I know this is hard. I know it feels like nothing is making sense right now, but you're safe here, And I'm going to make sure you and Mia have everything you need, everything you deserve. Anna looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. But how can I trust you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How can I trust anyone when everything I thought I knew about Grace and now it's all different? The question stung, and Richard felt the full weight of it. He had never realized how deep Anna's fear of abandonment ran. He had never truly understood the extent of her need for reassurance, for safety, for someone to hold on to in the chaos. I understand, Richard said softly, kneeling down to meet her eyes. It's hard to trust again, especially when everything feels like a lie. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm here for you, and I'll keep my promise to Grace, no matter what. Anna's gaze softened as she met his eyes. For the first time in days, she seemed to believe him. She nodded slowly, a silent agreement passing between them. She wasn't ready to fully trust him yet, but she was willing to take a step forward. The days that followed were filled with restless moments where Richard's mind refused to rest. He threw himself into his work, but the questions about Grace's secret life never stopped gnawing at him. Every time he looked at the twins, he couldn't shake the sense that there was so much more to discover, so much about Grace that he had never known. Every document he'd found, every clue, seemed to lead to more questions. One afternoon, as Richard was sitting in his study, poring over the papers Grace had left behind, he was startled by the sound of the doorbell ringing. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone, and with everything that had been happening lately, it felt like the world was closing in on him. He stood up, the tension in his body palpable, and walked to the front door. As he opened it, he was greeted by a man he didn't recognize, dressed in a dark suit, his face stern and unreadable. "Mr. Collins?" the man asked, his voice low but firm. Richard's mind raced. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" The man's eyes scanned Richard's face, as if assessing him. "I'm here on behalf of someone you know, Grace Collins." He paused, watching Richard closely. "I believe you've been looking into her affairs." Richard's heart stopped. The mention of Grace's name, spoken by someone who clearly knew more than he did, sent a jolt through his chest. "I don't understand," Richard said, his voice tight. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed Richard a small envelope, its edges frayed as if it had been handled repeatedly. "Grace left this for you," the man said, his tone colder now. "She wanted you to have it when the time was right." Richard took the envelope, his fingers trembling as he turned it over. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew, deep down, that this was a turning point, a moment that would change everything. Before he could open the envelope, the man turned and began to walk away. "There are things you don't know," the man called over his shoulder, his words heavy with implication. "And if you're not careful, you might not like what you find." Richard stood frozen at the door, the envelope still in his hand, his mind racing. The man's words echoed in his head. "There are things you don't know." What did he mean? And what did Grace want him to uncover? With trembling hands, Richard stepped back into the house and closed the door. He stood in the foyer for a moment, staring at the envelope, the weight of the situation sinking in. He couldn't ignore this. Grace had left him a message, a final piece of the puzzle that he had to uncover. Richard sat down at his desk, carefully opening the envelope. Inside, he found a letter. Grace's handwriting was instantly recognizable. His breath caught in his throat as he read the words, each one like a dagger to his heart. "Richard," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means I've left this world. I hope by now you've realized the depth of my love for you and the life we shared. But there's more, so much more, that I couldn't tell you. You see, when I made my promises to you, I made promises to others too. The girls you've taken in, Anna and Mia, they aren't the only ones I've helped." Richard's hands trembled as he read on. The letter explained that Grace had been running a charity, one that helped families in need. Families like the Bennett family, the twins' mother. But it didn't stop there. Grace's charity had become something much more. She had been secretly helping dozens of people, many of whom had no idea she was the one behind it. And then came the shocking part. The letter mentioned Richard's role in all of this. Grace had left him something he didn't know about. The details were vague, but it was clear that whatever Grace had left for him, it was going to be more than he ever expected. As Richard finished the letter, he felt a deep sense of loss. Loss for the wife he thought he knew, loss for the woman who had kept so many secrets from him, and loss for the future he had envisioned with her. But more than that, he felt an overwhelming sense of duty. Grace had entrusted him with something important, something he hadn't fully understood. And now, it was his turn to step up, to fulfill the promises she had made, to protect Anna and Mia, to honor Grace's legacy, and uncover the full extent of the secrets that had been buried. The days that followed were filled with relentless searching and uncovering the hidden truths Grace had left behind. Richard couldn't escape the weight of her legacy, her secret charity, her unspoken promises, and the paths she had paved for others without him ever knowing. The mansion, once a place of isolation, now felt like a crossroads, with Richard standing in the middle of a past he had never understood and a future he wasn't sure he could handle. Late one night, after hours of going through Grace's letters and documents, Richard found something that shook him to his core, a final letter, not addressed to him, but to the girls. It was sealed with a symbol he didn't recognize. His heart raced as he opened it, the words inside almost too much to bear. My dear Anna and Mia, the letter began, written in Grace's familiar, elegant script. If you're reading this, it means I've passed away. I've watched over you both from afar, knowing that one day you would find your way to the family that I promised you. Richard is the one I trust with your futures, and he will protect you, love you, and provide the home you both deserve. The words cut through Richard like a knife. Grace had always known this moment would come, and somehow she had been preparing for it, even when he hadn't been. His chest tightened, and for the first time since he had learned of Grace's secret life, he understood what he needed to do. Grace's final words filled him with both a sense of duty and a deep ache. She had trusted him with more than just the girls. She had entrusted him with a legacy, with a promise of love that reached beyond her death. The next morning, Richard sat down with Anna and Mia. They had become more than just two lost girls. They had become a part of his life, a life he had never imagined for himself. But it wasn't just about taking care of them anymore. It was about honoring Grace's legacy and building a future that they could all share together. Anna sat in front of him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Mia sat beside her, still holding on to her stuffed bear, her face still carrying the sadness of everything she had lost. Richard knew they were both still struggling, but there was hope in their eyes that hadn't been there before. I know this is hard, Richard began, his voice steady, his heart full of emotion. But I'm not letting you go. You're not alone anymore. I'll make sure you both have everything you need. We're going to make a home here, together, and I'm going to keep Grace's promise to you. Anna didn't say anything at first. She simply looked at him, her gaze softening. Slowly, she nodded, as if understanding that his words were more than just a promise. They were a commitment. To her, to Mia, to Grace. I think I can trust you, Anna said quietly, her voice still unsure, but tinged with the vulnerability that came with the decision she had just made. I think we can be a family. Mia, who had been quiet throughout, finally spoke up, her small voice full of longing. Will we be okay? She asked, her eyes searching Richard's face for the reassurance she so desperately needed. Richard smiled softly, his eyes filled with tenderness. We will be okay. I promise. In the following weeks, Richard threw himself into creating a stable life for Anna and Mia. They started to settle in, slowly but surely. The mansion, once a place of grief and loneliness, began to feel like home. Richard spent more time with the girls, showing them love and care, even as the weight of the promise he had made to Grace weighed heavily on him. The relationship between Richard and the girls grew stronger, their bond deepening with each passing day. Anna, once wary and distant, began to trust him more, and Mia's quiet sadness started to lift, replaced by the tentative joy of feeling safe. But Richard knew that there were still many unanswered questions. The mystery surrounding Grace's life, the legacy she had left behind, the ties to her charity, and the people she had helped, all of it still hung over him. And the phone call, the one that had warned him to stop digging, still echoed in his mind. Who had Grace been involved with? What did they want from him? As he sat in his study one evening, the phone rang again. Richard froze, the dread creeping up his spine. He had expected it, but not this soon. Mr. Collins. The voice on the other end said, its tone cold, unyielding. I've been waiting for you to make a move. I suggest you stop searching. There are things about your wife's past that you won't want to uncover. Richard's heart raced, his mind immediately flashing to the letter he had found. Who was this person? What was Grace involved in? But before he could ask, the line went dead, leaving him with more questions and answers. The days passed, and Richard found himself more deeply entrenched in his new life with Anna and Mia. They had become his family, the girls filling a space in his heart that he had thought lost forever. Despite the shadows of the past, Grace's hidden charity, the mysterious calls, and the unresolved questions, Richard knew one thing for sure. He would protect them, honor Grace's promise, and give the twins a life they deserved. But the phone call, the threat of unknown forces, remained in the back of his mind. He knew there was still much to uncover. But for the first time, Richard felt a glimmer of hope. He was no longer alone in his grief. He had Anna, he had Mia, and together they would face whatever came next, no matter the secrets that still loomed over them. With the final letter Grace had left behind, Richard understood that he had inherited more than just a promise. He had inherited a legacy of kindness, love, and protection, and he would not fail her. For the first time in months, Richard smiled genuinely, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Whatever the future held, he knew one thing. Grace's legacy would live on in the love he gave to Anna and Mia.